Serious, what stories about ww2 did your grandparents tell you, and or what did you find out about their lives during that period? Attention. Serious tag notice. Jokes, puns, and off-topic comments are not permitted in any comment, parent, or child. Parent comments that aren't from the target group will be removed, along with their child replies. Report comments that violate these rules. Posts that have few relevant answers within the first hour, and posts that are not appropriate for the serious tag will be removed. Consider doing an AMA request instead. Thanks for your cooperation and enjoy the discussion. I'm a bot, and this action was performed automatically. Please contact the moderators of this subreddit if you have any questions or concerns.
My grandfather was scheduled to storm the beach on D-Day. He managed to dodge this because his sergeant or some other higher up got shit-faced the night before and messed everything up. So it's fairly likely that alcohol saved his life. Actually, most soldiers who went on the beaches didn't die, even in Omaha. It was a hellish landscape and it took hours to finally take it, but you were more likely than not to survive it. The one outlier would have been if he was in the first wave.
We needed those people too. While Europe completely destroyed itself, American industry was able to pump out equipment for the Allies. Big reason we won the war. Like they say, amateurs think tactics, professionals think logistics. More a question of scale. If your job is to take a hill in a day, logistics doesn't matter. If your job is to keep the hill, it is a different story.
My grandpa had a similar accident, was sent to Berlin, happened to be working on the roof, and someone forgot he was up there and moved the ladder. He slipped, snapped a tendon, and wound up being trained as a medical assistant. Unfortunately, this meant he saw a lot of bad stuff, including having to treat a good friend who then died. He suffered from PTSD and depression the rest of his life, but was a wonderful grandpa. He had trouble talking about the war, so rarely did. While he was in Berlin, he fell in love with a German girl, and asked her father for permission to marry her. He was told no because not only was he American but he was Italian, which was even worse to the father.
My grandpa very rarely talked about it, but he was in the Pacific in ww2. He caught malaria, and was sent to a hospital ship to recover, and the Japanese sunk the ship, so he floated for like 10 hours clinging to the wreckage, with active malaria, before finally being rescued, and after all that, he re-enlisted and fought in the Korean War also. What a badass. It is honestly crazy to think how badass some people are in real life.
My grandfather would talk about the training time with his unit while being transported, but mostly about a little kid he was helping feed in China after Japan surrendering. He would just think aloud about what happened to him and if he was alright. He never talked about combat. I did walk into his house once and the History Channel was on showing a USMC graveyard on Okinawa and he was crying. My father joined the 8th underage serving in New Guinea and the islands. He also used to tell me stories of the training, and of the silly things they'd do to pass the time. It wasn't until we were both older that the memories started coming back, and he'd wake with nightmares. When I stayed at his house I'd sometimes find him awake at 0300 sitting in the kitchen. It was then he'd tell me about some of the other things he'd seen. Poor bastard had kept it inside for over 50 years.
My grandfather befriended a German family during the war. They would cook him meals, and the mother would wash his clothes. One day he loaded up a box with eggs, and used toilet paper, to make sure they didn't break. The next day there was a note in his laundry thanking him for the eggs, but an even bigger thank you for the toilet paper. They hadn't had any in years. I had a great uncle who was part of the occupying forces in Germany. He loved dogs, and purchased a full-blooded German Shepherd while overseas. He couldn't keep the dog with him, so he had a German family look after the dogs. Meat was hard to come by, so every week or so, my uncle would bring the family meat to feed the dog. It was only after getting the dog home my uncle discovered the dog absolutely loved sauerkraut, and didn't quite know what to do with the meat. It turns out the German family was taking the meat for the dog, and eating it themselves, and feeding the dog sauerkraut.
My great-grandfather never talked about the war until he had his stroke. We knew he had a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, but we didn't know how he got them. He was just a private, and he'd had enough of the military when the war was over. After the stroke, he seemed to loosen up. He laughed about sighting rifles and by shooting at chickens. He showed us pictures of him in front of the Eiffel Tower. Turns out he was occupation force. ended up occupying an area near Berlin that became involved in the Battle of the Bulge. Apparently, while he was fighting, some sort of explosive blew off his buddy's leg, so Grandpa did what anyone else would do and threw his buddy over his shoulder to get him to the med tent. This included running across a field in the line of sight of a German machine gun nest. He was shot in the leg and some more shrapnel ended up in his chest. Somehow, Grandpa and his buddy survived. We thought he was embellishing it, but the Bronze Star paperwork included a report that we found after he passed away. 2 higher-ups signed that the story was true, so I guess I have to believe it. He told us it wasn't that big of a deal and that he didn't deserve all those medals for what he did. What a badass. RIP, Gramps.
My granduncle was part of a cleanup crew in Japan after the Battle of Leyte, so after all the fighting was done, they'd send his unit in to clear out the bodies of the fallen Japanese. He said that they would loot their bodies, take treasures like knives, swords, gold off the teeth, and then put their bodies on a giant landing craft, the kind that open up on a beach, and take them out to sea to dispose of them. He says he'll never forget watching the sharks just go to town on the dead. Haunts him to this day. Edit. This was in Philippines, not Japan, but it was a battle against the Japanese. Another edit. The intention was to give them a sea burial, since the Japanese left their dead upon retreat. It wasn't meant to desecrate the deceased further. Out of all of the entires that I've read so far, for some reason, this unsettled me the most.
My grandfather joined up in 1943 when he turned 18 years old. He was stationed on a Pacific island where he basically became a radar O'Reilly. His family were Mennonites, so he was a conscientious objector. He was a medic, clerical worker, cook, ditch digger, driver, and anything else that he was asked. Most of his time was spent cleaning up after everyone else and watching for air raids by the Japanese Air Force. Do you know any more about what the radar teams did? I always knew my grandfather served in World War II, but I recently learned he was a staff sergeant doing radar in the Pacific Theater.
My grandmother was a Jew in a Nazi concentration camp. She was pretty much certain to die, because she didn't have a job and she wasn't cunning enough to survive on her own. It was rough. One day some local farmers in Russia bought her to work for them during the day, so she would go to the farm to work during the day and come back at night. The farmers would feed her and clothe her. They also helped her sneak food into the camp. Often, I don't know how, she would sneak soups into the camp to give to her friends and family. The farmers were endless in their kindness and helped her survive until the Nazis were defeated and everyone was released. My grandmother was reunited with her family and lived a long life until she died last year. Without the farmers' kindness, I don't think I would be here today.
You know, now that I think about it, I don't remember my grandma ever telling me about World War II and her life through it. I know my dad was born a year after, so she must have done some celebrating when it ended. LOL. Edit. My dad was born 6 months after the war ended. My grandfather wouldn't talk about it either. He didn't think anyone should be cursed to know the kind of horror he had to experience. One thing I did overhear him talking about with another veteran was seeing UFOs. He was dead serious, a little scared, and wasn't the kind of person to exaggerate or make things up.
My grandfather was pretty rich from real estate in the coastal province of Zhejiang in China, until the Japanese invaded. He and his family relocated to the inland wartime capital and worked as a telegraph operator for the war. The Japanese took everything from everyone back then, and nothing was the same afterwards. Coupled with a civil war right after, and things were pretty shitty. My great grandfather and grandfather were businessmen based out of Singapore, with business and land in China. When the war came, they lost everything. By the time China reopened after the Civil War, the land had been seized. In Singapore, the Japanese had basically destroyed the business and the workforce, pretty much destitute after the war. Same story on the other side of the family too. My paternal grandfather got stuck in Penang whilst his family was in Singapore. He only met them 30-ish years after the war.
The only thing my grandpa ever said about the war was how he made his engagement ring out of a quarter using a tablespoon. I assume he saw some shit. I did however meet a Nazi airplane mechanic, 90 years old, and dude still had all his wits about him. Interesting convo. American quarters were mostly silver back then, so that would actually be a pretty decent engagement ring, and I imagine silver is soft enough to work with a tablespoon. That's pretty freaking resourceful.
My grandmother was in Auschwitz, so nothing good. She and her oldest sister moved from Lithuania to Poland under fake identities, but were later arrested and identified when her sister and her husband were caught forging documents for French prisoners of war, and a friend sold them all out. She went into the camps a young woman with 2 parents, 4 grandparents and 6 siblings, and left with virtually no living relatives. I was just talking to my grandmother recently, she's alive and in her 90s, about her grandfather who was a high-ranking member of some military or another, and was under a lot of pressure at one point to essentially change his last name to something not Jewish sounding, and convert himself and his family to Christianity in order to continue his peaceful and prosperous existence. But he refused, not really thinking about it. I said, imagine how much trouble it might have saved you if he had. She's Jewish on both sides of her family, so I don't know how that would have worked exactly, but again I wasn't really thinking about my words. And she laughed a bit and said, I don't think so. In Russian there's an expression, and then she paused a moment, as if considering how to translate it, and said, you get punched in the face, not the passport. Thank you for watching this fantastic video. Please tap one of the 4 videos on the screen for another amazing Ultra Reddit video.